Some of country music's greatest legends didn't lose their careers because of bad songs or fading fame. They lost them to addiction. Behind the sold-out concerts, standing ovations, and million-dollar records were nights filled with whiskey, pills, loneliness, and self-destruction. Some showed up drunk on stage. Others disappeared into darkness when the spotlight faded. And for a few of these stars, the very thing that made them unforgettable also became the thing that slowly destroyed them. George Glenn Jones. Before the addiction, before the arrests, and before the endless stories about whiskey and disappearances, George Glenn Jones was simply one of the greatest voices country music had ever heard. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Nashville viewed him as untouchable. His voice carried heartbreak in a way few singers ever could, and audiences believed every word he sang. But behind the standing ovations and sold-out shows, George Jones was slowly falling apart. Alcohol became part of his everyday life long before fans fully realized how serious the problem had become. Friends later described nights that blurred into mornings, with Jones drinking heavily before concerts, after concerts, and sometimes instead of showing up entirely. His addiction soon began controlling his career. Promoters grew nervous whenever his name appeared on a ticket because nobody knew whether he would actually arrive. Eventually, he became infamous across the country music world for missing performances so often that fans gave him a cruel nickname, No-Show Jones. The tragedy was that his talent never disappeared. Even during the darkest years of addiction, George Jones could still step onto a stage and silence an entire room with a single song. But the chaos surrounding his personal life became impossible to ignore. His marriage to Tammy Wynette collapsed under the pressure of alcoholism, emotional instability, and constant turmoil. Stories of drunken arguments, reckless behavior, and disappearing for days became part of his legend. By the late 1970s, many people in Nashville quietly believed George Jones was destroying himself faster than anyone could save him. The voice was still there. The fame was still there, but addiction had already stolen control of his life. To Hiram Hank Williams. Long before modern country stars filled stadiums and earned millions, Hiram Hank Williams became the first truly tortured soul of country music. His songs sounded painfully honest because they came from a man already fighting demons most fans could not see. To audiences in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Hank Williams seemed unstoppable. Hits like Your Cheating Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry turned him into a national sensation almost overnight. But behind the fame was a young man drowning in pain, addiction, and exhaustion. Hank lived with severe chronic back pain caused by a spinal condition that followed him throughout his life. Doctors frequently gave him alcohol, morphine, and various painkillers to help him function during endless tours and performances. Over time, the medication mixed dangerously with heavy drinking, creating a cycle that became impossible to control. Friends later described him as unpredictable, brilliant one night, completely lost the next. As the addiction worsened, his career slowly became chaos. Hank began missing shows, arriving intoxicated, or collapsing emotionally before performances. Members of the Grand Ole Opry eventually lost patience with his behavior after repeated no-shows and drunken incidents backstage. In one of the most shocking moments in early country music history, Hank Williams was fired from the Opry, despite being one of its biggest stars. What made the tragedy even darker was how young he still was. While fans saw a confident country legend in a cowboy suit, Hank was physically and emotionally deteriorating at terrifying speed. His marriage collapsed under the pressure, his health worsened constantly, and the loneliness around him grew deeper every year. On New Year's Day in 1953, Hank Williams died alone in the back seat of a car at just 29 years old. The man who helped define country music had ultimately been destroyed by the very addictions that once numbed his pain. 3. Donald Eugene Lytle. By the time Donald Eugene Lytle became famous under the name Johnny Paycheck, Nashville already knew he was dangerous. His voice carried the roughness of a man who had lived hard long before success arrived, and audiences loved him for it. Songs like Take This Job and Shove It turned him into one of country music's biggest outlaw stars during the 1970s. But behind the rebellious image was a man losing control of himself faster with every passing year. Unlike many country singers who tried to hide their addictions, Johnny Paycheck almost seemed consumed by them openly. Heavy drinking became a daily routine, and drug use followed closely behind. Friends and musicians who toured with him later described nights filled with violent arguments, paranoia, and complete emotional collapse. Some performances ended with him barely able to stand. Others never happened at all because he disappeared into another binge before reaching the stage. The more chaotic his personal life became, the more unstable his career grew. Promoters feared booking him. Venues worried about his temper. Stories of backstage fights and reckless behavior spread across Nashville until they became part of his reputation. Yet fans continued showing up because when Johnny Paycheck was sober enough to perform, he could still electrify an audience with raw honesty and pain that felt completely real. But addiction eventually pushed his life into darker territory than almost anyone expected. Financial problems mounted. His health deteriorated. Then came the incident that shocked country music entirely, a shooting at a bar in Ohio that led to prison time and public humiliation. By then, many people believed the self-destruction had gone too far to reverse. What made Johnny Paycheck tragic was that underneath the scandals and addictions was undeniable talent. He had the voice, the charisma, and the authenticity audiences craved. But the drugs, alcohol, and constant chaos slowly consumed the man behind the outlaw image until very little remained except the wreckage of a once brilliant career. For Waylon Jennings. Before addiction nearly destroyed him, Waylon Jennings represented freedom in country music. During the 1970s, he became one of the defining faces of the outlaw country movement alongside Willie Nelson, rejecting Nashville's polished image and creating a rougher, more rebellious sound that fans immediately embraced. His deep voice, leather vests, and fearless attitude made him look unstoppable. But behind the outlaw legend was a man quietly spiraling into one of the worst cocaine addictions country music had ever seen. At the height of his fame, Waylon Jennings was earning millions, selling out concerts across America, and recording hit after hit. Yet life on the road became increasingly fueled by drugs. Cocaine flooded the outlaw country scene during the late 1970s, and Jennings soon became heavily dependent on it. Friends later admitted that enormous amounts of money disappeared into his addiction every single day. Some claimed he was spending thousands of dollars weekly just to maintain the habit. The drugs slowly changed him. Tour schedules became chaotic, moods became unpredictable, and paranoia began creeping into his personal life. Those closest to him watched the warm and charismatic performer transform into someone exhausted, angry, and emotionally distant. His marriage suffered under the pressure, and many around him feared the addiction would eventually kill him. Then came the terrifying moment that forced reality into the open. In 1977, federal agents raided his recording studio, searching for cocaine. Although Jennings avoided prison, the scandal humiliated him publicly and exposed just how deep the problem had become. Nashville tabloids and newspapers suddenly viewed the outlaw lifestyle less as rebellion and more as self-destruction. What made Waylon Jennings different from many others on this list was that he eventually fought his way back. In the 1980s, he finally quit cocaine and tried rebuilding both his health and career. But even years later, he openly admitted that addiction had nearly destroyed everything: his body, his relationships, and the life he had worked so hard to build. 5. Jackie Keith Whitley. When Jackie Keith Whitley first arrived in Nashville, many people believed they were witnessing the future of traditional country music. His voice carried a rare mixture of sadness, warmth, and vulnerability that immediately connected with audiences. By the late 1980s, songs like When You Say Nothing at All and Don't Close Your Eyes transformed him into one of country music's fastest rising stars. But while fans were falling in love with the man on stage, Keith Whitley was privately fighting a dangerous addiction that had already followed him for years. Alcohol had become part of his life long before fame fully arrived. Friends from his early bluegrass days later admitted that drinking was deeply embedded in the culture surrounding constant touring and late-night performances. At first, it seemed manageable. Keith remained charming, funny, and incredibly talented. But as his success grew, the pressure around him intensified, and so did the drinking. Unlike some stars whose addictions exploded publicly, Keith Whitley's decline happened more quietly. He often appeared calm in interviews and professional on stage, hiding how serious the problem had become behind closed doors. But those closest to him knew the truth. His wife, Lori Morgan, desperately tried helping him through repeated attempts to stop drinking. There were moments when it seemed he might finally regain control. Then, the cycle would begin again. The tragedy surrounding Keith Whitley became even more heartbreaking because his career was only beginning to peak. Nashville executives believed he was on the verge of becoming one of the defining country voices of his generation. Fans saw a sensitive storyteller whose music felt painfully real. Few realized that many of those emotions came directly from his own struggles with loneliness and addiction. In May 1989, Keith Whitley died from alcohol poisoning at just 34 years old. Country music lost one of its purest voices almost overnight. To many fans, his death still feels less like the end of a career and more like the loss of a future that never had the chance to fully happen. 6. David Allan Coe. Few men in country music ever built a reputation as wild and unpredictable as David Allan Coe. Long before he became famous, Coe had already created an outlaw image filled with prison stories, biker culture, and constant rebellion. By the 1970s, that image helped turn him into one of country music's most controversial stars. Songs like The Ride and You Never Even Called Me By My Name made him unforgettable to fans who admired artists living outside the rules. But behind the outlaw persona was a man whose addictions and destructive lifestyle slowly pushed his career into chaos. David Allan Coe lived exactly the kind of life Nashville feared. Heavy drinking, drugs, endless partying, and violent confrontations surrounded him for decades. Unlike many country singers who tried protecting their public image, Coe often seemed to embrace the chaos openly. Stories of cocaine use, drunken behavior, and explosive backstage incidents followed him almost everywhere he toured. Some fans loved the danger around him. Others watched his career become increasingly unstable because of it. As the years passed, the controversy surrounding Coe began overshadowing the music itself. Promoters worried about booking him because nobody knew what might happen during a performance. Relationships inside the industry deteriorated, and many mainstream country outlets slowly distanced themselves from him. While his talent as a songwriter remained undeniable, his reputation for reckless behavior and addiction made him increasingly toxic to Nashville executives. The saddest part was that David Allan Coe possessed enormous musical ability beneath the scandal. He could write deeply emotional songs filled with loneliness, regret, and vulnerability that felt painfully authentic. But his addictions and constant self-destruction kept pulling him further away from the success many believed he should have achieved. Even as country music evolved into a more polished industry, Coe remained trapped in the outlaw world he helped create. Over time, the drinking, drugs, and controversy transformed him from a respected rebel into a cautionary tale about how addiction can slowly consume not only a career, but an entire identity. 7. Melinda Gail McCready. When Melinda Gail McCready burst onto the country music scene in the mid-1990s, Nashville believed it had discovered its next major female superstar. Performing under the name Mindy McCready, she possessed everything the industry wanted: beauty, charisma, emotional vulnerability, and a voice powerful enough to dominate country radio. Her debut album produced massive hits almost immediately, and for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could stop her rise. But behind the success was a woman already struggling with emotional pain, addiction, and instability that would eventually consume her life. As fame grew, so did the pressure surrounding her personal life. Mindy became trapped in a cycle of unhealthy relationships, depression, substance abuse, and public scandal that slowly overshadowed her music career. Alcohol and prescription drugs became increasingly tied to her emotional struggles, and the tabloids quickly turned her suffering into entertainment. Arrests, hospitalizations, and highly publicized breakdowns transformed her from a rising country star into one of Nashville's most tragic headlines. What made Mindy McCready's story especially heartbreaking was how visible her pain became. Unlike older country legends who managed hiding their addictions for years, Mindy's battles unfolded publicly in front of television cameras, gossip magazines, and relentless media coverage. Each attempt at recovery seemed followed by another collapse. Friends later described her as someone desperately searching for peace, but unable to escape the darkness surrounding her life. The music industry also failed her in many ways. Instead of protecting a struggling young artist, Nashville often treated her breakdowns as scandalous publicity. As her addiction worsened, record labels distanced themselves, radio support disappeared, and her once promising career slowly faded away. In 2013, after years of emotional turmoil and addiction, Mindy McCready died at just 37 years old. For many country music fans, her death felt deeply disturbing because it was not sudden or unexpected. People had watched the collapse happen in real time. Beneath all the scandal and tragedy remained a gifted singer whose life might have been completely different if addiction and emotional pain had not taken control so early. 8. John R. Cash. By the time John R. Cash became known around the world as Johnny Cash, he already sounded like a man carrying enormous weight on his shoulders. His deep voice, dark clothing, and haunting songs made him one of the most recognizable figures in American music history. Fans saw him as strong, rebellious, and almost indestructible. But behind the image of the Man in Black was a performer fighting an addiction so severe that it nearly destroyed both his career and his life. During the height of his fame in the 1960s, Johnny Cash's schedule became relentless. Endless touring, recording sessions, television appearances, and pressure from the music industry pushed him physically and emotionally beyond exhaustion. To keep going, he became heavily dependent on amphetamines and pills. At first, the drugs seemed like a solution. They gave him energy for constant travel and performances. But eventually, they began controlling every aspect of his life. As the addiction deepened, Cash became increasingly unpredictable. Concerts were canceled. Performances became erratic. Friends and family watched him disappear into long binges fueled by pills and alcohol. At one point, his behavior became so unstable that many in Nashville believed his career was effectively over. Arrests related to drug possession damaged his public image, while financial problems and emotional collapse pushed him dangerously close to losing everything. His relationship with June Carter Cash became one of the few things keeping him from complete destruction. She stood beside him during some of his darkest years, even as addiction nearly consumed him entirely. Cash later admitted there were moments when he no longer cared whether he lived or died. What makes Johnny Cash's story different from many others is that he survived long enough to rebuild himself. After years of battling addiction, he eventually regained control and experienced one of the greatest comebacks in music history. But the damage addiction caused never fully disappeared. Behind the legendary voice and iconic image remained a man who spent much of his life fighting to escape the darkness that nearly buried him forever. 9. Troy Lee Gentry. For many country music fans in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Troy Lee Gentry seemed like the definition of Southern confidence and success. As one half of the duo Montgomery Gentry, alongside Eddie Montgomery, he became known for songs celebrating blue-collar pride, small-town values, motorcycles, and hard living. Their music connected deeply with working-class audiences across America, and the duo quickly became one of country music's biggest acts. But behind the loud concerts and outlaw image was a lifestyle filled with alcohol, nonstop touring, and dangerous excess. Unlike some artists whose addictions completely exploded in public, Troy Gentry's struggles were more connected to the exhausting culture surrounding country fame. Endless travel, constant performances, late-night partying, and heavy drinking became normalized parts of life on the road. Friends inside the industry later described a country music environment where alcohol was everywhere, backstage, on buses after shows, and during nearly every celebration. Over time, that lifestyle slowly began affecting both physical health and emotional stability. The pressure of maintaining fame also weighed heavily on him. Montgomery Gentry built their image around toughness and living wild, but privately, the nonstop pace became draining. Many country artists of that era quietly battled exhaustion, substance use, and emotional burnout while trying to maintain the image fans expected. Troy Gentry was no exception. As the years passed, the hard-living reputation surrounding the duo increasingly became part of their identity. Stories of heavy drinking and reckless touring culture followed them constantly. While Troy never completely lost his audience the way some others on this list did, the lifestyle around him reflected the same dangerous patterns that destroyed many country stars before him. In 2017, Troy Gentry died in a helicopter crash before a scheduled concert in New Jersey. His death shocked the country music world. And while the tragedy itself was not directly caused by addiction, his story still represented a darker side of country fame, a culture where nonstop pressure, excess, and hard living often blurred together until artists no longer knew how to slow down or escape it. 10. Billy Joe Shaver. Few songwriters in country music ever lived a life as brutally honest as Billy Joe Shaver. Long before mainstream audiences recognized his name, Shaver had already become one of the most respected writers in outlaw country. His songs were filled with pain, redemption, broken families, addiction, and survival because he had personally lived through all of them. Artists like Waylon Jennings helped bring his music to a wider audience during the 1970s. But while Nashville admired his talent, Billy Joe Shaver was privately fighting the same destructive addictions that haunted many outlaw musicians of his era. Shaver's life was shaped by hardship from the very beginning. Raised in poverty in Texas, he experienced instability and loneliness long before fame arrived. When success finally came, alcohol and drugs quickly became part of the outlaw country culture surrounding him. Heavy drinking, cocaine use, and reckless living followed him through decades of touring and songwriting. Unlike polished Nashville stars, Billy Joe Shaver rarely hid the darkness in his life. He openly sang about pain because he was still living inside it. The addiction slowly damaged both his career and personal relationships. Financial struggles constantly returned despite his songwriting success, and periods of self-destruction repeatedly interrupted his momentum in the industry. There were years when his behavior became so chaotic that many people believed he would never escape the cycle. Yet, even during his darkest moments, Shaver continued writing songs with an emotional honesty few artists could match. What made his story especially tragic was the amount of loss surrounding him. Over the years, Billy Joe Shaver endured devastating personal tragedies involving family, illness, and emotional trauma that pushed him even deeper into addiction and depression. Music became both his escape and his confession. Although he survived far longer than many of his outlaw contemporaries, addiction still stole enormous pieces of his life. The hard living permanently shaped his body, career, and emotional world. Beneath the reputation of a fearless outlaw songwriter remained a wounded man trying to outrun pain he could never fully leave behind.